Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. What I want to do, I'm interested again largely in issues of identity and how Torontonians understand themselves in a landscape, make a mark on a landscape, and how that landscape can reflect their presence after they're gone. So what I do at Heritage Toronto is largely work in the area of commemoration. So you can see where my brain goes, and it's through everything. We do everything through walking tours, and I actually have some brochures that I can hand out if you're interested. The Walk Tomorrow is in partnership with Witchwood Barns Community Association, and they've been doing it now for a few years with us. That's the kind of work we do around the city. So we get to interact with a lot of local communities, and I've learned a lot from them and become really quite interested in how, again, cultural communities move through the city and leave a mark. So that's my interest today, looking at St. Clair, which I think is a bit of a microcosm of that story, as many neighborhoods are. Lots of people have done really great research on St. Clair, particularly the Little Italy, which I'll get into, and with Richard Harris stopped off on. John Zucchi, Frank Iacovetta, Robert Harney, Nicholas Harney. Great book, of course, on the history of St. Clair neighborhood, St. Clair in Pictures by the Toronto Public Library, Barb Mervold and Nancy Byers. They've done excellent work. What I typically do at Heritage Toronto, because I don't have a lot of time to hit the archives anymore, is take what other people have done and play with it and see what I can pull out of it to talk about what we've done. And that's what I'm doing today. Not much original, but some reflections which might be. So I'd like to talk about landmarks and institutions, first of all. I think when we move through a landscape, and this relates to, I think, Edward Keenan's lecture last night, when we move through a landscape, what I notice are the larger scale institutions, signage that somehow indicates to me someone was here before, right? There's curious buildings, curious sites that become landmarks. What are some of those in this neighborhood that represent some of the cultural change over time? I want to have a quick peek at Oakwood Collegiate. Schools are a really neat angle on looking at diversity in neighborhoods. Spent some time flipping through their yearbooks, which was quite fun. And then want to talk about events and how events can brand a neighborhood. And this goes to your question, Jay, about what's unique about any one neighborhood. And I think I'll be touching on a little bit of that, certainly today. So I'm interested in ethnic or cultural diversity, and I'm interested in it largely from Bathurst to Keele. Those are the boundaries that I could try to chew off today. The diversity of the street, of course, is pretty exceptional, and this is why I'm not going down as far as that, but that's Timothy Eaton Memorial Church. I'm going to start somewhere around here, St. Michael and All Angels Anglican Church in 1909, just a rough wood structure. So this plays back to, again, what Richard was talking about in terms of the birth of the neighborhood. What I find fascinating when we're looking around the city at various cultural groups moving into the city, whether it's the Filipino community or the South Asian community or the Italian community or the Chinese community, many of these communities come in and begin with key institutions that kind of ground them in a neighborhood. And those institutions, as, again, Richard said earlier, are often churches. The Korean community, for example, at Bloor and Spadina, Alpha Korean Church was kind of their main stop, first in the 60s. And in fact, there's stories of the customs people at Pearson, when they had a Korean immigrant come in, and there were very few coming in the late 60s, but more coming, they would actually call the minister of Alpha Korean Church to say, can you help translate? So they kind of had the number on speed dial. There's that sense of churches being not just places of worship, of course, but community centers. For the Filipino community, that was Our Lady of Lourdes in St. Jamestown, et cetera, et cetera. So in this area, it's very much, at first, Methodist, Anglican, and Presbyterian churches. This is a very British, again, and Protestant neighborhood when it gets built up in particularly in the 1920s, by the end of the 1920s. And to give you a hint of where this talk is going, St. Matthew's United Church, which is today at Rushton in St. Clair, is the successor of 5 local churches that have all merged into it. So there were once 5 churches related to that United Church history. Now there's 1. They've all kind of merged in. I think that's much of the story of St. Clair. Again, St. Michael of All Angels Anglican, 1909, first built at Vaughan and St. Clair. Now it's at Witchwood in St. Clair, brand new building, obviously. This was their first start. The churches were very interested in this period in establishing missions. And they were actually trying to get ahead of the population, too. They wanted to get there first, intense competition. for neighborhoods to influence those neighborhoods. And this is a reflection of the Anglican Church. Robert Longworth, who is a longtime resident, wrote an article in the 90th anniversary edition for St. Michael's and All Angels Anglican with an anecdote that I thought was pretty fun. When St. Michael and All Angels had a Sunday school picnic, they had it on a Wednesday, and the story went that schools were deserted. So if you decide to take all the kids, for that Sunday school for St. Michael and All Angels, you have that kind of impact on the neighborhood. The importance of that Protestant area in those Protestant churches is also relayed, I think, by Harry Rasky, a documentary filmmaker who grew up in the neighborhood in the 1930s, wrote his autobiography called Nobody Swings on Sunday. How many of you know this great quote? You might know the quote. He spoke about Earl's Court Park and swings actually being padlocked. Tennis courts, the nets would be taken down for Sunday. Swings would be padlocked. You may not swing. And he found one free once, and he told the story of hopping on the swing, swinging. Policeman comes up, grabs his shoulder, and said, "Nobody swings on Sunday." Right? So it tells you something of the influence, I think, in the area. The Earl's Court branch of the Toronto Public Library, and libraries are great places to see this diversity as well, begins in 1913 in the hall of Earl's Court Methodist Church. Again, this was mentioned. And Peter Bryce, who we've already heard about, says when he's arguing for a new library funded by the Carnegies, that the neighborhood, the local population is, quote, largely made up of immigrants from the United Kingdom. The people are of the artisan class, industrious, and self-respecting. It's one of the most progressive working men's communities, is how he describes it. And that library, when it's built out, there's St. Clair's Church, comes in 1910. I hope I have an image of, I bounced through my slides. So this is an example down in Chinatown of another changeover of a building, and if you've moving from a Church of Christ building through a synagogue to now a Chinese community center. And then I want to get to this. If you manage to get into Earl's Court Library, you can check out the murals. And again, a little indication of the neighborhood that it's serving. In the murals, there's little scrolls around the corner representing authors, and every one of those authors or writers is British. So that's the kind of crowd that they're expecting to be in the library. There is a Sons of England Benevolent Society and Daughters and Maids of England Benevolent Society meeting in Creeber Hall at 1337 St. Clair. I think the original building might still be there. And there's an Orange Lodge that's existing in that building into the 1950s as well. So signs of that older culture. And then comes the change, and these numbers come from, again, St. Clair Weston Pictures. In 1951, 70% of the population, and this is running from about, I believe it's from Dufferin or Bathurst over to Caledonia roughly, and on the south side, so it gives us a window, and it's not really comprehensive. 70% are British, 5% Jewish, and in 1951 already, 7.5% Italian. 1961, 42% British, 30% Jewish. Sorry, that shouldn't be. That's 30% Italian and 3.5% Jewish. And then in 2001, the Jewish is dropping again, the Italians staying fairly consistent at 30%, but the Portuguese are a much larger population. So that's just kind of a quick look at the larger population groups that are moving through the city. What's interesting is the 1920s directories, and this is again from St. Clair and Pictures, they found a number of Jewish shopkeepers and Italian fruit marketers already in the 1920s. And we know that from Harry Rasky, and his recollections are really quite fun. He called the 1200 block of St. Clair being as Jewish as Tel Aviv in July, is his line from the book. A whole row of shopkeepers. And we know from another article that about 32% in 1951, 32% of the stretch that's now Little Italy shops were actually operated by Jewish proprietors. So it's interesting that we don't think of that area as Jewish, given that there was such a huge presence. We think of it today as Italian. Another example of the Jewish community, and here's some numbers again of shops. 1951, 42% of the shops are owned by British, 32% Jewish, really high number. Italian 11%, By 1981, British owned 4.5% of the shops, 66, sorry, I flipped those numbers again, 7.5 are Jewish, 66 are Italian. This is the building, which I find really fascinating, and this was designed by Kaplan and Sprackman, who are some pretty significant architects in the city. Shirai Shomayim congregation moves into this building in 1948. They're originally connected to a Beth Israel synagogue on Mackay Avenue, and that still stands. You can actually go see the little building that's founded there in about 1921. So we're talking very early, a synagogue, and that's the synagogue that Harry Rasky talks about his community attending. There's a split. This congregation moves out, buys the lot in the 1930s, builds a basement in 1936, can't finish it until 1948, and when it's opened, 400 Orthodox Jewish families are attending. The Premier of Ontario is there, the Mayor of Toronto is there. It's reported in the Globe of Mail. It's a big moment, and it's a big building. How many of you recognize it? So if you know the neighborhood, it became the Hungarian-Canadian Cultural Center in 1970. So the Jewish community remains there until about 1966. They move up, following the pattern of Jewish migration, above Lawrence, Glencairn, and Bathurst, and this becomes the Hungarian-Canadian Cultural Center in the meantime. Beth Israel Synagogue on Mackay also becomes a Hungarian United Church in 1980. So these transitional moments in institutions, I think, are interesting to talk about the populations. And then the Italians. And it's the Italian presence, of course, which I think overwhelms all of the others, particularly west of here, and that I think ends up defining St. Clair in some pretty interesting ways. The Italian community exists again. This has all been written up elsewhere, but it exists already by the 1890s at Davenport and Dufferin. And they're working in the industrial areas over by Lansdowne and staying in rooming houses. And then we see them show up in the institutional record in 1914. The Methodists, who are again staking their claims in the area, establish a Dufferin Street Italian Methodist mission. Dufferin, just south of Davenport. And then St. Clement Roman Catholic Church is established as an Italian national parish on Dufferin, south of Davenport in 1915, and it becomes St. Mary of the Angels in 1936. So the Italians actually get a parish dedicated to them in 1915 in the neighborhood. It tells us how long this goes back. And then in the post-war period, obviously that mass influx of Italians, very high numbers, that come to this city and then move up into this area that establish it as the Italian neighborhood that it's certainly known to be still today, which I think is part of the interesting story. One of the significant cultural institutions that the Italians form quite early is Brandon Hall, or the Italo-Canadian Recreation Club. It's actually south DuPont and Dufferin area, but that's one of those clubs that for them becomes a key center of culture, right? And these are the institutions that I think become interesting. And it was written up in an article by Gianni Grohovats, and he wrote, "Given the evidence, it's not difficult to say that everything that is Italian-Canadian in Toronto today can trace its roots back to 33 Brandon Avenue." So if you can think of an Italian club or organization, many of them found their roots in that particular place, including the Brandon Group in the 1960s. And I don't know if you'll hear about that tomorrow when it comes to employment and labor, but very important labor organizations are formed there as well as the Canadian Italian Businessmen Professionals, or Business Professionals Association. St. Clair Roman Catholic Church, again in the area in the 1914, begins Italian language classes or Italian language services in the 1960s. And then the Italians get two more churches in the area as well that become dedicated to them: St. John Bosco in 1961 and St. Nicholas of Bari in 1967. So in that church history, you see the Italians. In that institutional history, you see the Italians moving into the area. The library, again, interesting to look at the libraries. In the 1950s, the library has its first Italian language books coming into Earl's Court Library. So a little window there. And then the first Italian librarian is hired in 1962, and they have an Italian speaking librarian from there forward. So again, libraries are great places. Ask about their collections and when their language collections begin, and you get a neat window on the community as well. St. Michael's and All Angels benefits from newcomers as well, but interestingly, they're Caribbean. So that's an interesting church to look at, where there's a significant Black Caribbean population that comes into the area and goes to St. Michael's at All Angels. They have their first Black warden in 1968. And it's controversial, which is also part of the story of these changeovers in the neighborhoods, but a neat indication of another element of diversity in the neighborhood. A plaque representing the members of the Italo-Canadian Recreation Club in 1946. That now resides at Villa Colombo up at Lawrence, which is really another center as movement shifts northward for the Italians. Oakwood Collegiate, and I'm not sure, I lost my time, so I just want to, okay. Oakwood Collegiate, and the collegiate itself is up on the hill. So this is about 1911, looking west along Clair. So again, you can see how things have changed so dramatically. But Oakwood is there already in 1908, and it's an interesting place to look at some of the diversity. There it is about 1930. So again, all I did was pop through the yearbooks, but I wanted to get a sense from student bodies if we could see how the neighborhood was changing. And a couple of caveats, because students for TDSB high schools can come from all over. It's not just local neighborhood. And obviously school groups are formed for all kinds of reasons. You might have a very small number of students from a particular cultural group, but they have a very strong leader and a teacher that's somehow helping them out, and they can form a club. So clubs kind of vary for a number of reasons, but nonetheless, I think it's a quick, interesting place to bounce through. One interesting thing of note is that there was a UNESCO program, the Associated Schools Project. Anybody familiar with this? I wasn't familiar with it, neither was the TDSB archives until I started poking around. They did some digging. 1953, UNESCO starts an Associated Schools project to try to encourage schools to work in support of international understanding, peace, intercultural dialogue, and sustainable development. Oakwood is the first Canadian school to sign on in 1955. So that's interesting in and of itself. And then that program, and this is a shot from the 1976 yearbook, carries on until around 2000, I believe. The Italian Club from 1969 has a great little descriptor too. In schools such as Oakwood, where the majority of the student body is Italian or of Italian origin, it's necessary that there should exist an organization with a residence in which these students and others interested can meet to discuss their problems, exchange ideas in order to expand their knowledge about a culture which has been one of the greatest of the world. So we're talking often the children of immigrants, trying to understand themselves in this Canadian context, right? And forming student groups where they can meet culturally. I come up from a little town called Alliston, an hour north of Toronto. None of this happened. We did not have ethnically focused groups, culturally focused groups, simply because there was no diversity to make it happen. It's a much more common story in Toronto, but I think it's an interesting one as young people try to figure out how they relate to those around them as well. The Ukrainian Club forms in 1969, and they say, we in the club have gained a deeper respect for our culture through our club discussions, and they want to spread the knowledge of Ukrainian culture throughout the school. So there's a pride of telling the story, and more people need to understand my culture as much as trying to understand their own. And then bouncing through the years, the Black Students Organization is formed in the early 1970s. This is 1973. The photos and the hair are fabulous alone in all of these images just to look at. They are interested, and they're participating in what becomes the UNESCO Bazaar. So that UNESCO club starts to set up a mini version of Caravan. If you've heard of Caravan in the city of Toronto, it starts in 1969. And the idea is that organizations will open up their buildings and cultural groups and welcome people into them, feed them some cultural foods, and then do some dancing and performances, and that's a way of sharing the culture with others. Well, this is what begins to happen with the UNESCO program. Grease, 1980, 2 years after Grease the movie, and Grease lives on at Oakwood with the Hellas dancers. The Karate Club, Korean Club, the Portuguese and Spanish Club in 1986 is interesting. The Chinese Club in about 1990. The Afro-Can Club, which is a later version of the Black Students Organization. I think the one dies and this one comes back. Alma Latina in 1996. A Muslim Student Association in 1996. And then an article in 1987 which talks about, that was written up in another Fresh Perspectives, talks about why these groups are important. And again, it's very much focused on understanding their own traditions, but also trying to bridge gaps. So there's a moment in Canadian multiculturalism, in the development of multiculturalism, I think in the 80s and 90s, that's very much focused on that kind of organization, whether it's Caravan in the city of Toronto, that becomes very, very popular. This UNESCO Bazaar or Carnival that's put on at Oakwood is very, very popular. And it actually becomes quite competitive, I'm told, by the 1990s, where students are, booing one group, cheering their own, right? And this kind of interesting, trying to build a sense of identity in your school through the high school. That's Oakwood Collegiate. Again, a glimpse, I think, more than anything else, to help us sort some of that stuff out. Parades, and I'll wrap up talking about a couple of parades. How much time have I got? Okay. So parades in the city are a great way of staking your claim. Parades are not just about saying, hey, let's celebrate something, but they're owning public space. And I think parades in the street, whether it was the Orange Order in 1912, or whether it's Caravana in 1968 in front of City Hall, these are moments when people, by parading through the streets, very publicly declare their presence in that space and can have a sense of ownership as well. Well, what's happened on St. Clair, I think this is the big moment for St. Clair Avenue. So if we're going to talk about what's unique about St. Clair Avenue, I think the 1982 World Cup celebrations on St. Clair are a defining moment for St. Clair Avenue and for the Italian community for a whole number of reasons. The Italians are at a point in their development, their cultural development in the city, where they're established. They've been here for a good number of years, decades. Italy internationally is doing better. There's a source of pride there. And then comes this World Cup celebration. And 200,000, roughly, Italians come from around metropolitan Toronto and crash St. Clair Avenue and shut it down. And celebrate and party. And this is an iconic moment. And speak to any Italian who was around in that period in Toronto. And this is a moment of great pride. It's been described by Pal DeLilio to me, and he's from Villa Charities, as kind of a coming out moment. This was a big moment, a source of pride, where they had the street, right? And they were declaring their presence, but also feeling like they could celebrate themselves. And the response to this was also very important. It was an overwhelmingly peaceful celebration. And all the stereotypes of Italians, and there were many going into this period, were the mafia was a big one in the 1970s with The Godfather. They were fighting these stereotypes of crime. Here was, 200,000 up to 500,000. You see those numbers. No violence. Completely peaceful. Considered one of the largest sporting gatherings in Toronto's history up to that point. Great source of pride that it was peaceful. They were there and they celebrated and had a great time and no violence and showed themselves to be the community they were. So a very important moment. There's that same view a little bit earlier in 1920. And then I'll wrap up a couple of photos from the Star, which I think are interesting, and I won't get into them now. But the stereotypes still show up in the newspaper articles. One article talked about bellies and bare feet and bicycles took over St. Clair. Other images. Here's one that I thought was very interesting from the Toronto Star. Italians celebrate with an orgy of emotion. Would we use that language today? But so, the world in which these people are living is very clear, but, a major moment for them. What's the one that's defining? 2006, they went again, and then I'll end here. The one that's defining St. Clair Avenue today, which I find very interesting, is salsa on St. Clair. And I talked with Councillor Mihevik about this a little bit. A major celebration now that's bringing again 100,000, 200,000 people onto the street to celebrate Latin American culture. How is it related to the existing population is an interesting one. It's not a grassroots boiling up, but it's something that comes to St. Clair and I think is now rebranding St. Clair in many people's minds as a Latin Quarter. There is no such place in Toronto, but this kind of parade can do that very much in our minds, and that becomes a unique identifier again for the street. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you for your patience.